The old hydraulic doors groaned as they slid open at Morgan Reed's repair station. A thick cloud of coolant vapor rolled out into the bay, and Morgan had to wave her hand through the mist to see what was coming through. She wiped the grease off her palms with an already dirty rag and squinted at the ship that was barely holding itself together as it drifted into her airlock. The thing looked like it had been dragged through hell and back. Black scorch marks covered almost every inch of the hull, like someone had used it for target practice. One of the stabilizers was bent at such a weird angle that Morgan wondered how the pilot had even managed to land without spinning out of control. Pieces of metal plating hung loose, and she could see sparks shooting out from somewhere near the engine compartment. Morgan had been running this station by herself for 2 years now, ever since her dad died. Some days were harder than others, especially when she walked past his old workbench and saw his tools still hanging exactly where he left them. Business wasn't great either. Most ships just flew right past her little orbital platform, heading for those shiny corporate repair docks that orbited closer to Mars. Those places had fancy waiting rooms and coffee machines that actually worked. Morgan had a broken coffee maker and a space heater that only worked when it felt like it. But she kept the place running. She paid the bills, kept her tools maintained, and most importantly, she kept the promise she made at her father's funeral. He always said that you never turn away someone who needs help, no matter how broke you are or how bad business is going. That's just what decent people do. The cockpit hatch suddenly opened with a horrible grinding sound, like metal scraping against metal. Morgan winced at the noise. A tall figure stepped out, moving real careful and stiff like every movement hurt. The pilot was definitely not human. He stood about 7 feet tall, with deep blue scales that caught the dim light of the bay. His body was lean but muscular, built like a fighter. What really caught Morgan's attention were his eyes. He had 3 of them, arranged in a triangle pattern on his face, and they all blinked at different times as they adjusted to the lighting in her station. He wore some kind of military uniform, or at least it used to be a uniform. Now it was torn in several places and stained with something that looked like oil mixed with blood. Whatever he'd been through, it hadn't been pretty. "Human," he said, and his voice came out strange. It took Morgan a second to realize he was wearing a translator device clipped to his collar. The thing processed his actual speech and turned it into English, but it sounded flat and emotionless like a computer reading an instruction manual. "I require immediate repairs. My quantum drive is failing." Morgan grabbed her diagnostic scanner from the workbench. It was one of the few pieces of equipment her dad had splurged on back in the day, and it could read pretty much any ship system in the known galaxy. "Name's Morgan," she said, walking toward the ship. "Let's take a look and see what kind of trouble you're in." The alien pilot introduced himself as Thane. He stepped back and watched as Morgan dropped to her knees and crawled underneath his vessel, holding the scanner up toward the engine compartment. Her tablet screen lit up immediately, flooding with data and warning messages. Morgan let out a low whistle. This was bad. Really bad. "Your containment field is collapsing," she said, still studying the readings. "The quantum drive is hemorrhaging energy. If I'm reading this right, you've got maybe 6 hours before the whole thing tears itself apart. After that, you won't have to worry about pirates anymore because you'll be scattered across this entire sector in about 1,000,000 pieces." She heard Thane shift his weight above her. When he spoke again, his shoulders had sagged down, and even through the flat translator voice, she could hear the defeat. "I have no currency you would accept. My credits are not recognized in this sector of space." Morgan pulled herself out from under the ship and stood up, studying him. Despite all the alien features, the scales and the extra eye and the build, he looked young. Maybe not much older than she was. And there was something in the way he held himself that reminded her of a scared kid trying real hard to act brave. "So who's chasing you?" Morgan asked, crossing her arms. Thane was quiet for a moment. His 3 eyes looked away from her, focusing on the floor. "Pirates," he finally said. "They ambushed my patrol route 3 systems back. My entire squadron was destroyed. I am the only one who managed to escape." Morgan walked over to her supply locker and pulled it open. Inside were containers of rare earth elements, synthetic compounds, and specialized materials that cost a fortune. She pulled out the ones she'd need for a quantum drive repair and set them on her workbench. "These materials right here cost more than I make in 3 months, she said. "Maybe 4 months, depending on how business goes." "I understand," Thane said quietly. His voice had dropped even lower and the translator barely picked it up. "I will wait here then. I will die with honor, as is my people's way when there is no other option." Morgan stopped what she was doing and turned around to stare at him. "Die with honor? Are you serious right now?" She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Look, I don't care what your people's way is. Nobody is dying in my garage. Not today, not ever if I can help it. Now sit down, be quiet, and let me work. But the payment? Thane started to protest. I cannot pay you for. Did I ask you for payment? Morgan interrupted him. She was already pulling cables out and connecting them to his ship's access ports. Listen to me. You're breathing. You're in trouble. And you landed at my station. That's all I need to know to get started. We'll figure out the rest later. For the next 14 hours straight, Morgan worked on that ship without taking a single break. Her back ached, her hands were covered in cuts from sharp metal edges, and her eyes burned from staring at tiny components for so long. But she kept going. She carefully bypassed the failing containment field, rerouting power through secondary systems that were never meant to handle that kind of load. She rebuilt the quantum coils from scratch, using a mix of Thane's alien technology and her own improvised solutions. Her dad had always taught her that sometimes the best fixes come from combining things that weren't meant to go together. At one point, while she was deep in the engine compartment, Morgan remembered something from an old human military schematic she'd studied years ago. It was a shielding technique that Earth's early defense forces had developed when they couldn't afford the fancy alien technology. She modified it and integrated it into Thane's shield generators. When she tested it, the readings showed a 32% improvement over the original factory settings. When Thane's ship finally hummed back to life, the sound was smooth and clean, nothing like the dying wheeze it had made when it first limped into her bay. Thane stood in the middle of the repair bay, completely speechless. His 3 eyes were wide, all of them focused on his ship like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Your shields are running 32% more efficient than factory standard, Morgan said. Morgan was reaching for her coffee mug when every alarm in the station started screaming at once. The mug slipped from her fingers and exploded against the metal floor, sending hot coffee splashing across her boots. She didn't even notice. Her eyes were locked on the screens that had just lit up like a Christmas tree, flashing red warnings everywhere. Something had just dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the sector. Something big. Really big. And according to her sensors, it was headed directly toward her station at full speed. Her hands were shaking as she pulled up the visual feed. For a second, she couldn't process what she was seeing. It didn't make sense. Her brain couldn't figure out the scale of it. Then the computer helpfully displayed the measurements, and Morgan felt like someone had dumped ice water down her back. A warship. But calling it just a warship was like calling the ocean just some water. This thing was a Kelsar Imperial cruiser, stretching out for nearly 3 miles from bow to stern. The hull was covered in weapons. Massive cannons that could probably crack a planet in half. Missile batteries that looked like they could hold enough firepower to vaporize Earth's moon. Energy shields shimmered around it like a soap bubble, except this bubble could probably withstand a nuclear blast. And right there on the side of the hull, painted in letters 50 feet tall, was the same insignia that Thane had worn on his torn uniform. The symbol of House Kelsar. No, 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 Morgan whispered, backing away from the console like it might bite her. Her mind was racing through possibilities and none of them were good. What did I do? What the hell did I do? Her radio suddenly exploded with noise. Dozens of voices all talking over each other and they all sounded terrified. Earth's defense fleet was scrambling every ship they had. She could hear commanders shouting orders, pilots reporting to their stations, and in the background news channels were broadcasting emergency alerts. Someone was screaming about an alien invasion. Another voice was demanding to know why a Kelsar warship was in their space without authorization. Morgan tried to hail the cruiser. She sent out every standard greeting protocol she knew. She even tried just saying hello in a dozen different languages. The massive ship ignored everything. It didn't slow down, didn't respond, didn't acknowledge any of the warnings that Earth's defense forces were broadcasting. It just kept coming straight at her tiny repair station like she was the only thing in the entire sector that mattered. The whole station shook when the docking clamps engaged. It felt like an earthquake, except Morgan was floating in space and earthquakes weren't supposed to happen here. Tools fell off her workbench. Metal groaned and creaked under the stress. For a horrible moment, Morgan thought the cruiser might accidentally rip her entire station apart just by docking with it. She looked around frantically for anything she could use to defend herself. Her hand closed around a wrench on the floor. A wrench. Against alien warriors who probably had weapons that could disintegrate her before she even saw them move. But holding it made her feel just a tiny bit better, so she gripped it tight and positioned herself in the middle of the bay. The airlock door opened with a hiss of pressurized air. Then soldiers started pouring through. 50 of them, maybe more, all wearing armor that looked like it could stop a tank round. They were Kelsar warriors, built like Thane but bigger, meaner, covered in scars and military decorations. Each one of them had weapons holstered at their sides. Nobody was pointing guns at her yet, but the threat was clear. These weren't mechanics or diplomats. These were soldiers who had seen real combat. They moved with perfect precision, forming two straight lines that created a path from the airlock to where Morgan stood. Not one of them looked at her. They just stared straight ahead, standing at attention like statues. Then Thane walked through the airlock and Morgan almost didn't recognize him. The last time she'd seen him, he'd been wearing a torn, blood-stained uniform and looked like he'd barely survived whatever he'd been through. Now he was wearing a pristine military dress uniform that probably cost more than her entire station. Medals covered his chest. Rank insignia decorated his shoulders. He looked like someone important. Really important. But it was the figure behind Thane that made all those soldiers stand up even straighter. An elderly Kelsar stepped through the airlock, moving slowly but with absolute authority. His scales were darker than Thane's, almost black, and they were covered in scars. Not just a few scars. Hundreds of them, crisscrossing his arms and neck and face. Each one probably had a story behind it. Each one was a battle he'd survived when others hadn't. His three eyes swept across the repair bay, taking in every detail. When those eyes landed on Morgan, she felt like she was being examined by something ancient and powerful and not entirely safe. "Morgan Reed," Thane said, and his voice had changed too. It wasn't the scared, defeated voice of a stranded pilot anymore. This was the voice of someone who commanded respect. "I present War Marshal Garrett Kelsar, Supreme Commander of the Kelsar Fleets, Guardian of the Outer Reaches, Protector of the Seven Systems, and my grandfather." Morgan's wrench slipped from her fingers and hit the floor with a clang that echoed through the silent bay. Her mouth was hanging open, but no words were coming out. Her brain had completely stopped working. The War Marshal stepped forward. Up close he was even more intimidating. He towered over her, and the scars on his face were deep, like something with very sharp claws had tried to tear his head off once. His voice, when he finally spoke, was deep enough that Morgan felt it in her chest. "You saved my grandson's life," he said, and unlike Thane's translator, his sounded more natural, like he'd actually learned English instead of just having a computer do it for him. "You used resources you could not afford. You asked for nothing in return. And you improved technology that my people have been using for centuries. The debt of House Kelsar is absolute." Morgan's voice came out as barely a squeak. "I just fixed his ship." "You did considerably more than that," Thane said. He gestured toward the airlock, and Morgan noticed for the first time that his ship had been brought aboard the massive cruiser. "After I returned home, my grandfather's chief engineers examined your work. They spent 2 days going over every modification you made. They're calling it revolutionary. You solved problems in 14 hours that our best engineers have been working on for years." The War Marshal nodded slowly, his ancient eyes never leaving Morgan's face. "We have a proposition for you, Morgan Reed. One that could change everything for your people and mine. But first, I wish to see your facility. I want to understand how a human works. Show me your methods. Show me how you think." Morgan led the War Marshal through her station, and she couldn't help feeling embarrassed about the whole thing. Her repair bay suddenly looked so small and run down with all these important military figures walking through it. The walls had rust spots she'd been meaning to fix for months. One of the overhead lights flickered constantly because she'd never gotten around to replacing it. Her tools were scattered across workbenches that had seen better days, probably back when her father first bought them decades ago. The War Marshal's entourage followed behind him like a small army. There must have been at least 20 Kelsar officers, all wearing fancy uniforms and looking around her station like they'd just stepped into a museum of ancient history. They picked up her tools carefully, examining them like they were trying to figure out how something so primitive could possibly work. A stern-looking female Kelsar with silver scales that caught the light stepped forward. She wore the insignia of a chief engineer, and her three eyes scanned Morgan's workspace with obvious disapproval. "You have no standardized protocols?" she asked, and her translator made her sound even more judgmental than she probably meant to. "No proper procedure documentation? No quality control systems?" Morgan actually laughed at that, which made several of the Kelsar officers look at her like she'd lost her mind. "Protocols? Lady, every single ship that limps through that airlock is different. I've fixed Earth cargo haulers held together with duct tape and prayer. I've worked on Martian luxury yachts that cost more than my entire station. Last month, I had a smuggler's ship that was running on 3 different types of engines because the owner kept stealing parts from whoever he could. You don't survive in this business by following some manual. You learn to adapt or you close your doors and go home." The War Marshal turned to look at Commander Hayes, which Morgan figured was the silver-scaled engineer's name. They exchanged a long look, having one of those silent conversations that people who've worked together for years can have without saying a word. Adapt, the War Marshal repeated slowly, like he was tasting the word for the first time. An interesting philosophy. They moved into Morgan's main workshop, where she kept her computer systems and design equipment. Thane's ship modifications were still pulled up on her screens, showing all the work she'd done. The Kelsar engineers crowded around, and within seconds they were arguing with each other in their own language. It sounded harsh and guttural, nothing like the smooth translated English Morgan had been hearing. They gestured at the screens, their voices getting louder and more heated. The War Marshal raised one hand, and the entire room went silent instantly. That kind of authority couldn't be taught. You either had it or you didn't, and this old warrior definitely had it. He turned to Morgan with those ancient, scarred eyes. Our fleet faces an enemy we cannot defeat, he said, and for the first time, Morgan heard something in his voice that might have been worry. They call themselves the Dominion. In the past year alone they have destroyed 17 of our warships. 17 crews gone. Thousands of warriors who trained their entire lives wiped out in minutes. They use weapons that bypass our shields like they're not even there. Our engineers have examined every battle recording, run every simulation, and they insist our technology is flawless. They say our shields have been perfected over 10,000 years of warfare. Nothing's flawless, Morgan said immediately. She caught herself and added, I mean no disrespect to your engineers or anything. But in my experience, if something's not working, there's always a reason. Mind if I take a look at your shield systems? That's how Morgan ended up being escorted aboard the massive Kelsar cruiser. The ship was incredible inside. Everything was clean and organized and built to last forever. The corridors were wide enough to fit 20 people walking side by side. The walls were made of some kind of metal alloy that Morgan didn't recognize, and it seemed to absorb sound so everything stayed quiet despite thousands of crew members working throughout the ship. They brought her to the shield control center, and Morgan spent the next 6 hours crawling through access tunnels that weren't designed for someone her size. She squeezed through gaps that the larger Kelsar couldn't fit into, analyzing power flows and checking connection points. She pulled up battle data on portable tablets, watching recordings of Dominion attacks frame by frame. She interviewed the engineers who maintained the systems, asking them hundreds of questions that probably seemed stupid but helped her understand how everything worked together. When she finally emerged from the last access tunnel, she was completely covered in hydraulic fluid. Her clothes were ruined. Her hair was plastered to her head with sweat and oil. She probably smelled terrible. But she had the answer. The War Marshal, Commander Hayes, and about a dozen other high-ranking officers were waiting for her in the main engineering bay. They all stopped what they were doing and turned to look at her. Your shields are amazing, Morgan said, wiping fluid off her face with her already dirty sleeve. Seriously, the engineering that went into these things is incredible. But they're rigid. They're designed to absorb hits from specific weapon types at specific frequencies. You've got protocols for every known weapon in the galaxy. When those weapons hit your shields, the shields know exactly how to disperse the energy. It's perfect. But, the War Marshal prompted. But when something new comes along, something your shields haven't been programmed to handle, they can't adjust fast enough. The Dominion weapons are hitting you with frequencies that fall between your established protocols. Your shields are trying to figure out which defense to use, and by the time they decide, the shot's already through. Commander Hayes bristled, her silver scales actually standing up a bit like an angry cat. Our shields have protected us for 10,000 years. We have defended against every threat in known space. Our technology is 10,000 years old, I know, Morgan interrupted, which probably wasn't the smartest thing to do to a commander, but she was too tired and too excited about her idea to care about proper military protocol. But that's exactly the problem. You've optimized yourself into a corner. You've made your shields so good at handling known threats that they can't handle unknown ones. 2 weeks had passed, and Morgan was deep inside Thane's ship, her arms buried up to her elbows in the shield generator housing. She was making the final adjustments to the modular system she designed, tweaking the power distribution nodes to get every last bit of efficiency out of them. Sweat dripped down her forehead, and she had to keep blowing hair out of her face because both her hands were occupied holding delicate components that couldn't be dropped. Then every alarm in the entire fleet started screaming at once. Morgan's head shot up so fast she nearly brained herself on the low-hanging conduit above her. The workshop lights switched to red emergency mode, bathing everything in an eerie glow. Through the bay windows, she could see the other Kelsar ships in the formation suddenly light up like Christmas trees, their shields activating to full power. "What's happening?" she shouted, but nobody needed to answer. She could see it on the tactical displays that lined the walls of the bay. The Dominion had found them. 12 enemy vessels had just dropped out of hyperspace in perfect attack formation, appearing out of nowhere like ghosts materializing in the darkness of space. They surrounded the War Marshal's cruiser and its escort ships in a sphere pattern, cutting off any easy escape route. Morgan had seen the recordings of Dominion ships before, but seeing them in person was different. They were sleek and black, shaped like predatory fish, and they moved with an efficiency that was almost beautiful if it wasn't so terrifying. The battle started immediately. The Kelsar ships moved into their traditional defensive formation, centuries of military doctrine guiding their every movement. It was like watching a perfectly choreographed dance. Their shields activated with a blue glow that shimmered across their hulls, layers upon layers of defensive energy fields designed to stop anything the universe could throw at them. The first Dominion barrage hit, and for a moment, Morgan felt hope. The Kelsar shields held. The energy blasts scattered across the defensive fields like water hitting a windshield, dispersing harmlessly into space. Then the Dominion weapons fired again, and Morgan watched in horror as the Kelsar shields started flickering. Just like the battle data had shown. Just like she tried to warn them about. The shields were trying to adapt to the weapon frequency, but they were too slow, too rigid, locked into protocols that didn't account for what they were facing. Thane. Morgan screamed into her comm unit, running toward the ship's cockpit. "Get your ship launched right now." Thane's voice came back and she could hear the stress in it even through the translator. "The retrofit isn't complete. We're still at 87% functionality. If I launch now, it's complete enough. Go, go, go." She felt the ship shudder beneath her feet as Thane fired up the engines. Morgan barely had time to grab onto a support beam before the ship lurched forward, rocketing out of the bay and into the middle of the battle. Through the cockpit windows, she could see 3 Dominion vessels immediately break formation and come after them, recognizing Thane's ship as a priority target. Morgan's heart was hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribcage. The War Marshal had insisted she observe the battle from the cruiser's bridge, but there hadn't been time to get there before the fighting started. Now she was stuck in Thane's ship, and all she could do was watch the tactical display and try not to panic. "Thane, listen to me," she called out, forcing herself to sound calmer than she felt. "Remember everything I taught you. Don't fight their way. Don't follow the standard protocols. Adapt." She watched the display as Thane's ship dove and twisted through space in patterns that no Kelsar pilot had ever used before. The traditional Kelsar fighting style was all about maintaining formation, presenting a unified front, using overlapping shields to create an impenetrable wall. But Thane was flying like a human would fly, unpredictable and chaotic, never doing the same thing twice. The modular shields Morgan had installed were working exactly like she'd hoped. When a Dominion energy blast came from the right, the shields automatically redirected power to that side, creating a reinforced barrier just where it was needed. When the attack shifted to come from above, the shields reconfigured in milliseconds, adapting to the new threat. The Dominion weapons were designed to overwhelm static defenses, but they kept hitting different shield configurations every single time they fired. Morgan switched her comm to the fleet-wide channel. "Commander Hayes, are you seeing this? Get your ships to copy Thane's patterns." There was a pause, and Morgan could imagine Hayes looking at the War Marshal for permission. These were warriors who had followed the same battle tactics for thousands of years. What Morgan was asking them to do went against every instinct they had, every bit of training that had been drilled into them since birth. "Forget the formations," Morgan yelled, not caring any more about military protocol or chain of command. People were dying out there while they hesitated. "Move unpredictably. Adapt your shields in real time. Don't give them a stationary target." She heard the War Marshal's deep voice cut through the comm chatter. "Do it. All ships, follow Thane's lead." The Kelsar fleet began to change before her eyes. Ships broke formation, and at first it looked like chaos, like everything was falling apart. But then Morgan saw the pattern emerging. Each ship was moving independently, but they were all following the same principle: adapt and survive. Their shields were reconfiguring constantly, creating new defensive patterns that the Dominion targeting computers had never encountered before. The Dominion had built their entire strategy around fighting enemies who were predictable. Their computers calculated the most efficient firing solutions based on traditional ship movements and static shield configurations. But now those calculations were worthless. Every time they locked onto a target and fired, the target had already moved and its shields had already changed. Morgan watched a Dominion ship take a direct hit from a Kelsar cannon and explode in a brilliant flash of light. Then another one, caught off guard by a Kelsar vessel that had approached from an angle that should have been impossible according to standard tactics. "That's it," Morgan shouted, coaching the fleet through the battle like she was teaching a class. "Don't think about doing it perfectly. Think about surviving. If something's not working, try something else. Use what works, abandon what doesn't. That's how humans fight. That's how you win when you're outmatched." The battle turned. The Dominion fleet, which had destroyed 17 Kelsar warships over the past year, was suddenly on the defensive. Their ships tried to retreat and regroup, but the Kelsar weren't giving them space. 6 months had passed since the battle, and Morgan still couldn't quite believe what she was looking at. She stood in the observation deck of what used to be her tiny rundown repair station. The place where she'd barely scraped by, where the coffee maker never worked and half the lights were always flickering. That station didn't exist anymore. Now it stretched out for miles in every direction. The Human Kelsar Military Engineering Academy, they called it. The first joint facility of its kind in galactic history. Where her old station had maybe 3 repair bays, this new facility had hundreds. Where she used to work alone in the dark with outdated tools, now thousands of people moved through the corridors every single day. Human engineers in their casual work clothes walked side by side with Kelsar warriors still getting used to the idea that you didn't need to wear full military dress uniform to fix a spaceship. They gathered around holographic displays, arguing about the best way to solve problems, sharing techniques that their species had developed over completely different paths of evolution. It was chaotic and loud and messy, and Morgan loved every second of it. She was technically the director of the whole operation now, though she'd fought hard against that title. The War Marshal had wanted to give her some fancy office with floor-to-ceiling windows and a desk made of rare alien wood that cost more than a small planet. Morgan had told him absolutely not. She still wore her old work coveralls, the same ones that were stained with oil and hydraulic fluid, and had her dad's name patch sewn on the front. She'd had them cleaned at least. Most days. Thane approached her carrying a data pad, and Morgan had to do a double take every time she saw him now. He'd been promoted to fleet commander after the battle, and he actually looked comfortable in the role. The scared young pilot who'd limped into her station 6 months ago was gone, replaced by a confident leader who other warriors looked up to. "Another species wants to send observers," Thane said, pulling up information on the data pad. "The VRNN Collective. Apparently they've heard about the human method, and they want to learn our techniques." Morgan actually laughed out loud at that. "The human method? That's what they're calling it?" "Thane, the human method is literally just, figure it out as you go and don't give up. That's it. That's the whole secret." "Precisely," came the War Marshal's deep voice from behind her. He'd walked up so quietly she hadn't heard him, which was impressive for someone his size. He looked different these days too. Healthier somehow. The weight he'd been carrying seemed lighter. Someone had told Morgan that defeating the Dominion after a year of losses had taken years off his life in the best possible way. He stood straighter now, and his eyes had a spark in them that hadn't been there before. "The galaxy has relied on perfection for so long that we forgot how to grow. How to change. How to adapt when circumstances demanded it." He gestured out the massive windows that looked out over the facility. "Your people, the humans, you were forced to improvise with limited resources. You never had the luxury of perfecting anything because you were always too busy just trying to survive. And that weakness, that limitation that the rest of the galaxy looked down on, turned out to be your greatest strength. You never stopped evolving." Morgan followed his gaze and looked out at the facility sprawling before them. Dozens of ships floated in various states of repair and modification. Some were Kelsar warships getting fitted with new modular shield systems. Others were human vessels being upgraded with alien technology that humans could never have developed on their own. In one bay she could see a mixed crew of humans and 3 different alien species all working together on something that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie. Human creativity was meeting alien precision, and the results were incredible. Problems that had stumped entire civilizations for centuries were being solved by mechanics who'd learned to make things work with duct tape and determination and a whole lot of cursing when nothing went right the first 5 times. "You know what's funny?" Morgan said, still watching the organized chaos below. 6 months ago I just wanted to keep my dad's garage running. I was worried about paying the electricity bill and whether I'd have enough money to buy replacement parts. I fixed Thane's ship because it was the right thing to do, not because I thought it would lead to any of this. I definitely didn't think fixing one broken ship would somehow change galactic politics." Thane moved to stand beside her, looking out at the same view. You didn't just fix a ship, Morgan. You showed us something that warrior cultures like mine had forgotten over thousands of years of military tradition. You showed us that kindness doesn't have a price tag. That innovation doesn't belong to any one species. That sometimes the best ideas come from the most unexpected places. That's worth more than any technology, more than any weapon system or shield generator or faster-than-light drive. Morgan felt her throat get a little tight. She'd never been good with compliments or emotional moments. She cleared her throat and changed the subject. So the VRYNN Collective, huh? What's their deal? They're having trouble with their faster-than-light communications array, Thane explained, pulling up more data on his pad. It keeps failing at random intervals and their engineers can't figure out why. They've been working on it for 3 years. And they think we can help? Morgan asked. The War Marshal smiled, showing those rows of sharp teeth that had terrified her 6 months ago but now just made her think he was amused. They think that if a human mechanic can revolutionize Kelsar military doctrine in one night of work, perhaps she can solve their communication problems as well. Down on the main workshop floor, Morgan spotted a young human engineer named Jake trying to explain something to a Kelsar veteran who'd been maintaining warships since before Jake's grandparents were born. They were both gesturing at a holographic display, clearly frustrated. Then something clicked and they both started laughing, that universal sound of relief when a problem finally makes sense. Morgan had spent her whole life being told that Earth was behind the rest of the galaxy. That humans were primitive, barely worthy of attention from the advanced civilizations that had been exploring space for millennia. That Earth needed to catch up, to learn from its betters, to follow the example of species who actually knew what they were doing. Turns out, the galaxy had it backwards. Sometimes the best solutions come from people who've had to make the impossible work with nothing but creativity, heart, and a stubborn refusal to give up even when everything seems hopeless. Come on, Morgan said to Thane and the War Marshal, heading toward the lift that would take them down to the workshop floor. I've got a new ship coming in later today. Some trader who says his engines are making a noise that nobody can identify. Want to help me figure it out? The War Marshal's eyes gleamed with something that looked a lot like excitement. Morgan Reed, I thought you'd never ask. Together, the three of them headed back to the workshop floor, where the real magic happened.